I trusted my own eyes for 31 years, before I finally learned to trust my own paperwork instead. That's the real story here, not the betrayal itself, but how long it took me to stop needing someone else's permission to believe what I already knew, and how much it cost me to learn that lesson at the age I learned it. My name is Margot. I should start further back than the bakery itself, because none of what happened later makes sense without understanding who I was before any of it began. I grew up in a house where money was discussed in whispers, where my mother kept a separate small envelope of cash hidden from my father, not out of malice, but out of a quiet, learned instinct that a woman should always have something set aside that nobody else could touch. I used to think that instinct was sad. I understand now it was simply early wisdom I hadn't yet earned the hard way. I met Celine at a culinary trade show when I was 26, 2 years before any of this started. She was magnetic in the specific way some people are, not loud, not performative, but the kind of person who remembered the name of every vendor's assistant and asked about their kids by name the following year. She had spent nearly a decade in food distribution before deciding she wanted to build something of her own, instead of just supplying other people's dreams. When she suggested we open a bakery together, I was flattered in a way that clouded my judgment more than I'd like to admit. I had the recipes, the technique, years of pastry training in a small kitchen in Lyon before I moved back. She had the contacts, the supplier relationships, the business instincts I didn't yet trust in myself. Trust builds businesses faster than contracts do, she told me the day we shook hands instead of signing anything formal. I was 28. I had just inherited a modest sum from my grandfather's estate, enough to cover 80% of our initial capital. And Celine had contributed the remaining 20% along with, she said, everything else that actually keeps a business alive. I believed that division of labour made sense. I believed it for 2 full years. For those 2 years, that trust seemed to prove itself right again and again, in ways that made doubt feel almost ungrateful. We built something real out of nothing, a corner storefront on a quiet street that smelled like brioche before 6 in the morning, a regular clientele who knew us both by name within months, a reputation that started drawing attention from local food writers by the end of our first year. Celine handled supplier relationships and social media, building an online following that brought in customers from across the city. I handled everything else: recipes, staffing, the books, the 4 a.m. mornings. Nobody glamorizes the constant small decisions that keep a kitchen running without anyone noticing how much work goes into making something look effortless. We called it partnership. I called it partnership, proudly, to my family, to old friends who asked how the bakery was doing. I didn't yet understand that partnership requires equal visibility into the numbers, not just equal warmth in the room. The first sign was small enough to miss, the way these things always are, buried in a column of numbers I'd looked at 100 times before without really seeing. I noticed during a slow month in our second year that our supplier invoices for flour and butter had crept up nearly 12% from the previous quarter, but Julien, the supplier Celine had personally sourced and maintained the relationship with since before we even opened, hadn't mentioned any price changes in any of our conversations. I asked her about it over coffee one morning before opening, gently. The way you ask a question you don't yet suspect has a difficult answer. She said Julien had quietly raised prices industry-wide, that everyone in the business was dealing with it, that she'd meant to mention it to me and simply forgot in the chaos of the holiday rush. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She'd built that relationship from nothing. She'd never once given me a reason not to trust her word on something like this. Here's what nobody tells you about being the one who trusts easily, the one who says, "We don't need contracts, we have trust," and means it sincerely. It means that when something doesn't add up, you spend weeks quietly doubting your own math, your own memory, your own competence, long before you ever consider doubting the person standing next to you at 5 in the morning. Flour on both your hands, laughing about something that happened the day before. The second sign came 4 months later, in early spring, when Etienne, a former supplier we'd switched away from in our very first months, before Julien came along, reached out directly, almost apologetically, at a regional Bakers Association mixer of all places. He asked carefully whether we were happy with our current pricing, because he'd heard through another baker in the area that we were paying well above market rate for basic ingredients like flour and butter, well beyond what even the recent supply chain issues would explain. I remember standing near the drinks table at that event, holding a glass I wasn't really drinking from, feeling something cold settle low in my stomach that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. I didn't accuse Celine, not that night, not the next morning, not for weeks afterward. I gave her every chance to be innocent, the way I always did, the way I'd been taught, somewhere underneath all my professional confidence, that a good partner extends before she ever questions. I spent 2 full weeks quietly gathering the actual invoice, not the summarized monthly totals she usually compiled and forwarded to me in a tidy spreadsheet, but the original itemized documents, which I requested directly from Julien's billing department, myself explaining simply that I handled our internal books and needed the originals for tax reconciliation purposes. Nothing dramatic in the request, nothing that would alert anyone to anything being wrong. What I found, laid out plainly across our kitchen table late one night after Celine had already gone home, my daughter's old baby monitor still sitting unused on the counter from years earlier because I never got around to putting it away, was this. Julien's actual invoiced prices had barely changed at all over 2 years, maybe 3% total, ordinary inflation, nothing alarming. But the amounts I had been personally approving for payment, based on the summaries Celine had been sending me every month, were consistently running 10 to 15% higher than what the original invoices actually showed. The difference was small enough each individual month to explain away as rounding, seasonal adjustment, minor fluctuation, but large enough compounded over 2 years to matter enormously. That difference, invoice by invoice, month by month, had been quietly redirected to a separate account Celine had set up, under a name deliberately similar enough to Julien's actual business, J. Aumont Supply, instead of his real company name, J. Aumont & Fils, that it would never draw a second glance on a bank statement glanced at quickly during a busy week. I sat with that kitchen table full of documents for nearly 3 hours that night. I didn't cry, which surprised me. I mostly just kept rereading the same 3 invoices over and over as if repetition might change what they said, the way you reread a text message from someone you love, hoping the words will rearrange themselves into something kinder. I didn't confront her that night, or the next morning, or even that week. I did something quieter instead, something that took considerably more discipline than shouting would have. I opened a business account of my own, entirely separate from our shared one, moved forward slowly and carefully, within the bounds of what our informal partnership actually allowed me to do, and hired an independent accountant, Nimid Priya, for a full financial audit of the business, framed to Celine not as suspicion, but simply as good practice before we consider expanding into a second location, which was true enough to say out loud without it being a lie, since expansion genuinely had come up in conversation months earlier. The audit took 5 weeks. Priya was thorough in a way I found strangely comforting, cross-referencing every invoice against every payment, against every bank transfer over the full 2 years of the business's existence, building a paper trail that didn't rely on anyone's memory or anyone's word, mine included. The audit confirmed everything the original invoices had already quietly told me, plainly, in numbers that didn't require anyone's testimony to be believed. Over 2 years, nearly $31,000 had moved through that secondary account, all of it siphoned incrementally from what should have been straightforward supplier payments, all of it under Celine's sole access and sole control, set up before either of us had even signed our first lease. I didn't raise my voice when I finally sat her down on a Tuesday afternoon after close, the oven still cooling behind us, flour dust still settling in the afternoon light through the front window. I didn't need to raise it. I simply placed both sets of documents on the table between us. Julienne's original invoices on one side, the doctored summaries she'd sent me on the other, the audit trail connecting every discrepancy to that second account in between, and let the numbers make the argument I never had to make with my own voice. She looked at the documents for a long time before saying anything at all. She didn't deny it for long once she started speaking. There wasn't much room left to, not with that much paper sitting between us. She said she'd started small, an emergency the first year, a medical bill for a family member she'd never mentioned to me in 2 years of near daily conversation, and told herself she'd pay it back once the bakery stabilized. She said the amounts had simply kept growing because the first time nothing happened and the second time nothing happened, and eventually the absence of consequence started to feel, to her, like a kind of permission. I listened to all of it. I didn't offer forgiveness in that moment, and I didn't need to offer condemnation either. The paperwork had already done what paperwork does. It had made the truth exist somewhere outside the two of us, somewhere neither memory nor charm nor good intentions could quietly edit later. Soline returned what she could over the following months, sold her remaining share of the business back to me, at a fair valuation that Priya helped us both negotiate cleanly, rather than face a formal legal filing that would have followed her for years afterward. She left quietly, the way people do when the paperwork has already decided the ending for them, long before either person says the final word out loud. We didn't part as enemies exactly. We simply parted as two people who now understood each other with a clarity that hadn't existed, while the trust was still intact. I kept the bakery. I kept the bricks, the ovens, the 4 a.m. mornings, the smell of brioche before 6 that first made the corner storefront feel like something worth building. I hired a new operations partner 8 months later, a woman named Adele with 15 years in supply chain management. And the very first thing I did, before we ever shook hands on anything, was hand her a formal partnership agreement, professionally drafted, every contingency accounted for, every access point to every account clearly divided and independently verifiable. She laughed a little when she saw how thorough it was. I told her, simply, that I'd learned the hard way what trust actually requires in order to be worth extending. Trust builds businesses faster than contracts do, Soline told me once, in the earliest days when everything still felt like it was made of nothing but good faith and early mornings. I understand now that it only feels that way right up until the exact day it doesn't, and that the version of trust worth having isn't the kind that asks you to look away from the numbers. It's the kind that survives you looking closely at every single one of them,